We finished this khutbah and we discussed the first two parts of this. We are now discussing the third portion of this, and then we'll talk about the fourth. There's one more discussion that inshallah next week we will have. If you remember, of course you remember, in the third or the second part of khutbah, Imam al-Salam counted, recognizing the world seekers, and he counted 4 categories of people. I'm not going to go into the details of those, but he mentioned these are the 4 people, that among them are he who is prevented from mischief only because of low condition. He was not able to. So it wasn't his skill that he was prevented from that. Then there was he who has drawn his sword openly and commits mischief. And then Imam talked about, among them is he who seeks benefits of this world through actions meant for the next world. And then lastly, Imam talked about 4th group, which were similar to the first group, but they had intentions behind it. Anyways, this was last week's discussion. Now Imam turns his attention toward the people of the hereafter. So the previous discussion was the people who are seeking this world, the people of the hereafter. He said, "Ar-Raghibuna fillah," those who are raghib, inclined toward Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then there remain a few people in whose case the remembrance of their return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the last day keeps their eyes bent, and the fear of resurrections move their tears. As any God-fearing person would be. That's what this group is. Imam then talks about some of their attributes. He says, فَهُمْ بَيْنَ شَرِيدٍ نَادٍ وَخَائِفٍ مَأْمُونٍ. Some of them are scared away from the world and then they're dispersed. Some are frightened and subdued. Some are quite as if muzzled. Some are praying sincerely. Some are grief-stricken and pain-ridden, whom fear has confined to namelessness and to disgrace that has shrouded them. So these people are in the sea of bitter water. Imam will explain why he's giving this analogy of bitter water. What's the difference between ma'ul milk and ma'ul zujaj? Both types of waters are mentioned of bitter water. Their mouths are closed and their hearts are bruised. They preached, and then the last part where Imam concludes this off, which I will keep it until we get to that part. So, the 5th group, so those were the 4 groups that Imam mentioned in the last part of the sermon, those who are seeking the world. Then Imam turns to this 5th group of people. So these are, Rijalun, those who are working thereafter, they're not for this world. After mentioning the 4 earlier groups of the worldly minded and sinful people, he turns to the 5th group. Who are these people? The friends of Allah, the soldier of truth, the men of God in an exceptional community. That's what he calls them. They existed in all times. Even in the time of Imam, they existed, and until today, this group exists. In societies where they previously mentioned 4 groups have taken control of affairs. Those were the groups who were causing mischief, they were running the affairs, they were subduing people, they were causing corruption, all that stuff. By those 4, amidst them exists this 5th group, which is therefore Islam and reform. So, but what happens to this 5th group? They're pushed to the margins of society, removed from its center, and they're left alone. And you see many today as well. Because of the greatness of their rank, this group, Imam elevates them. Because of their greatness, Imam refers to them as Rijal. Remember in the earlier khutbahs, probably in 20s, Imam speaks to people Rijal Ashbahul Rajal, he calls them. We know what? Those who resemble men, but they're not really men. This is a derogatory, this is mocking them. This is, as bad as it gets from the word of Imam. But here, he calls them Rijal after those four groups of people. I don't know if you noticed, the four earlier groups were not referred to as Rijal, they were referred to as Nas. Nas. Masses. He called them Nas because everybody is included into Nas. Ya ayyuhan Nas. Quran sometimes also speaks Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu. And it speaks to people in general, it says Ya ayyuhan Nas. So both are mentioned. There's a difference between the two. Imam called the previous group to be Nas, regular people. This group, Imam called them to be Rijal. These are men. In reality, this fifth group, whom the Imam regards as the axis of a mature, God-centered society, encourages his companions to be counted among them. He's giving this khutbah to masses, and he calls his close companions that you should be part of that group. I'll give you what attributes they have, and you should make sure that you have those attributes in you as well. He said what? Baqiya rajalun ghadda absaruhum. Amidst all this, there remain those whose eyes have been cast down by the remembrance of their children, and whose tears have flowed from the fear of gathering on the day of judgment. So these are the actual words of Imam. The word expression ghazzu absarahum, or ghadda absarahum, as the verb is used over here, is istilah which is used in Quran as well. When especially when you read the ayat of Surah Nur, ayat of hijab, for men and women, it says, Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu ghaddu absarahum. Or those who believe, men, cast down your gaze. Same thing, when it refers to mu'minat, it says the same exact thing, ayat number 30 and 31. This, when Imam says, Ghadza absarahum, does not simply mean closing their eyes. They're not closing their eyes. They are, this is lowering and averting their gaze. How many of you have been in a situation where you just look away? That awkward click. Because we live here in this part of the world, in this society, there might be awkward situations and places with our families where we need to look away. Or something which is not worthy of looking. You look at it and you're disgusted by it, and then you look away. This is what it means. It does not mean that they lower their eyes and they close their eyes and they're not wanting to, even take part. No. They're lowering it because of the, this person is a state that overcomes a person when confronted with terrifying scenes as well. So sometimes you see bad accident take place, and you just turn yourself away from it. You can't bear to see how terrible that was. Such that he is unwilling to look at the dreadful sight. Accordingly, this first description of them is their deep sense of responsibility before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the tribunal of the hereafter, when they will be standing in front of Allah. A very powerful awareness that makes their heart what? Tremble. Which is how I refer to, Imam did not mention anything about heart. All he mentioned was the moment their tears are flowing. So normally when your tears flow, your heart is shaking, your heart is trembling. He said, indeed, for those who possess a strong faith in the day of judgment, day of tribunal, there's nothing more terrifying than a day when the veils are lifted, the secrets are laid bare, and people can see it, and all the deeds of a person's lifetime are examined in the presence of all people. Some commentators of Najm mention that the word marja in the sentence above is used as grave, and mahshar refers to resurrection. Although it doesn't have to be. Both could refer to the same thing, the day of judgment. It's just that Imam, this is the work of eloquence. Imam did not want to repeat the same word. You and I also in our speech sometimes, We use different words to express the same thing. So Imam is also could be doing the same thing over here. In fact, the expressions of Imam are drawn from the noble verses of the Quran. The famous ayat, chapter 24, verse 37, Rijalun, Allah called them Rijal as well. La tulihihim tijaratun wala bay'un an dhikrillah. Wa iqam as-salat, wa ita' al-zakat, yakhafuna yawman, tataqallabu fihi al-qulub wal-absar. Men, again Allah called them men as well, Rijal, whom neither trade nor sale distracts them from the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. People get distracted so easily, these people remain focused. From establishing prayer, from giving zakat, and the fear of the day, the forest, and the eye will be over. So Imam then turns to, well, after explaining that this fifth group should exist, does exist, and this is their state. Then Imam talks about what happens to this fifth group. The varied fates of this group within society is dominated by those four worldly-minded groups. And Imam then said they, because of speaking the truth, they're always speaking the truth. They're like the Abu Dhar of Zaman. And seeking the truth are either driven out of society and become wanderers. What happened to Abu Dhar? He was, kicked out, and put in exile from Medina. Especially in the time of the third Khalifa. He was in exile. And then, interestingly, when he returns in the time of Muawiyah, he was sent to where? Sham. And then he made it difficult for Muawiyah and his people to live peacefully over there. And so, Muawiyah says to Uthman that I can handle this guy. I'm sending him back. So he sends him back. He comes back. And then he's it is mentioned that he's near the Jamarat, where you hit the shaitan in Makkah. Sitting there, he starts preaching. He starts talking about, these are people who are, disgraced, they should not be in power, they should not be in charge, and all that stuff. And of course, eventually, his fate, what it led to, how he was in exile. So, you think about him right here. Because of speaking the truth and seeking the truth, they're either driven out of the society, as that happened to him, or they become wanderers, or out of fear withdraw into lonely seclusion. Now this didn't happen to this gentleman, but usually those who are not as powerful as these companions of Amir al-Mu'mineen were. This happens, you go into seclusion, you say, well, I can't really do anything, so I'm in what? In Zebat, seclusion, all by myself. They remain silent and place a seal upon their mouths, for they find no attentive ear or awakened heart that can understand their words and respond to their call. Or they sincerely invite people toward Allah, those who are still willing to listen, to influence at least some hearts, those who are still awakened and have not gotten into a full slumber. Or they look on with tearful eyes and aching hearts. At scenes of rampant corruption, which they are unable to change because of the state that they're in. So then Imam said, for whom thus they are found between what? One driven away and fleeing into solitude in Zala. One fear, one silent with his mouth restrained, and the one who calls Allah with sincerity, and one grief-stricken and pain-ridden. So, then Imam goes into the explanation of each one of these istilahat, sharid, khaif, sakit, da. I'll skip all of these because you're not seeing it, so it would have been nicer if you were able to see these istilahat, these terminologies. It would have made sense. But we'll skip those istilahat. Then Imam then proceeds to describe other qualities of this group with a brief, profound, and sorrow-laden expressions. Explains their condition in such a society, قَدْ أَخْمَلَتْهُمُ التَّقِيَّةِ. Because of this present situation that these people are in, What do they have to do? Dissimulation. Taqiyya has rendered them secluded and consigned them to obscurity. Oh, there is a group like that exists as well. They're a forgotten part of the society. Nobody really remembers them, cares for them. Although they are fighters and strivers, when raising one's voice yields what? Nothing but destruction of the remaining strength. There's no choice but for them to do what? Do taqiyya. Well, taqiyya is for such situations. Taqiyya is where you have to save your life. You have to go along with what the society is preaching. A dissimulation that ultimately leads them into isolation or causes them to appear in the eyes of enemies as what? Cowardly. People think, they're cowards. They're not going to be able to do anything. And neither the friends think that these people are incapable, insignificant. Those in power, they consider them a coward. Those who are friends, they consider them to be incapable and insignificant. Reality is of duty. Their recourse to taqiyya is likewise a duty under specific circumstances. This is what Allah wants them to do at this moment. Nothing wrong with them to be practicing this taqiyya at this moment. Imam's famous words, "Kun fil fitnati ibn labun." Whenever fitna arises, be like that, sheep, that camel, the baby camel. Why? You can neither ride it, nor can you use its milk. It doesn't provide either one. So be like that in the time of corruption. Then Imam says the second. First one was taqiyya. Number two, he says, "Shamilathum dhillah." An abasement has enveloped them. They're honorable in the presence of Allah, in the sight of Allah, and within the depths of the soul. Yet society, where values have inverted, has condemned them to weakness and humiliation. So this humiliation is not humiliation, zillah in the sight of Allah. Right? Allah gives izzat. The izzat is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلِلَّهِ إِزَّةُ جَمِيعًا. To Allah belongs all the izzat. You are not the one to give izzat to anyone, honor to anyone. If people are saluting you in this world and they're honoring you, there's no reason for you to become all hyped up because of that. You don't know what the reason behind that is. Only izzat and honor in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then Imam portrayed their condition by saying, فَهُمْ فِي بَحْرٍ أُجَاجٍ. This is the description that Imam gave, that they are like those who have sunk and become trapped in what? Sea of salt. Salt water. بَحْرٍ أُجَاجٍ. Where every movement only causes what? Greater burning and more intense pain. Because the water is already very sour and bitter. It is obvious that one who is immersed in such a sea feels burning throughout his entire being. And whenever he becomes thirsty, there's no water for him to drink. You're in the water, but you can't drink it. It's too sour, it's too salty, it's too bitter. Thus, both inwardly and outwardly he burns. Such is the state of the friends of Allah and the righteous men when they become caught in societies filled with corruption and ruled by oppressive tyrants, for they find no helper or supporter with whom they can rise and raise their cry. Kind of like the situation of Imam in the first 25 years. Right? There are a few people who say to Imam, "Come on, stand up, rise, we're with you." But really nothing which is substantial enough. Then Imam continues this description by adding, أَفْوَاهُهُمْ ضَامِزَةٌ وَقُلُوبُهُمْ فَرِيحَةٌ. Their mouths are sealed shut and their hearts are wounded. Indifferent people in such societies are not troubled. Rather, they are concerned only with their own personal interests. But these strivers, the pure, the righteous, those who are struggling, whose mouths have been forcibly closed, they didn't want it, but they were forced into it, constantly burn inwardly, and their hearts are filled with wounds. We use the same istilah. Dil jo hai wo shikasta hai, toota hua hai, right? We use the same. And you can't tell, but that's the state sometimes people. So some commentators in Al-Balagha have understood the phrase qulubuhum qariha is referring to the fear of Allah. However, the context of the passage indicates that these spiritual and inner wounds are caused by the corruption, which they are unable to eradicate. At this point, some people might imagine, so this is where the final portion is, which the guy clarifies there in the beginning. At this point, the description that I have given to you of this fifth group of people, or Imam has given, I have just retold the story. Those who are in that state where they don't have power, they don't have the voice, they are striving, struggling, they're doing everything they can, and then even going into taqiyya. At this point, you might imagine that this weakness, incapacity, silence, and resort to taqiyya are the result of their own failings. This fifth group, they made a mistake themselves. It is their own failing that they have gone into seclusion, being forced to, to be left alone and quieting down and all that stuff. And then now eventually, taqiyya. That they did not rise up or cry out at the proper time. Now it's too late. They should have done that at that time when there was still opportunity for them. You might think about these people. Why are they so late to the party? Then Imam says at the conclusion of this passage that completely removes this misunderstanding with a few decisive sentences. No, don't think that these people are part of that group which comes late, joins them. I don't want to really compare it, but kind of like the Wabin, right? After the battle of Karbala is over, Imam has been martyred. Family has been made captives. Now the Wabin rise. Now they're the same Sulaiman ibn Surah al-Khuzai and the other groups who have written letters to Imam, promising support, now feel immense guilt that why did we give our swords away under the pressure of Ibn Ziyad? We should have stood up. And then in order to undo their mishap, what do? They blindly go into this battle. This group was referred to as Tawwabin. They did Tawbah, according to them. May Allah forgive them as well. But they were referred to as Tawwabin. They did Tawbah, and they said, at no cost we'll go ahead and take the revenge of Imam Hussein. Mukhtar said to them, no, hold on, this is not the way to do it. We need to be strategic about it. We cannot just go ahead and start waging war against a very powerful person, or very powerful, this whole government that we have in front of us. So you got to be careful about it. So Mukhtar was very strategic. He took his time. It took 4 or 5 years for him before he could deliver justice. But these people, out of the guilt, they got up one day and they said, that's it. Swords out. We're just going to go barge into the government facility. We're going to start fighting. And then they ended up losing their lives. So I don't want to compare this because that is not what Imam is talking about these people. This group, Imam removes this misunderstanding. He says, قَدْ وَعَدُوا حَتَّى مَلُّوا وَقُهِرُوا حَتَّى ذَلُّوا وَقُتِلُوا حَتَّى قَلُّوا. Beautiful, analogy, very poetic if you want to call it. They gave admonition until they became weary. They were oppressed until they were humbled. And they were killed until they became few in numbers. So you can't call these people to be those who did not rise up at the right time. You cannot consider these people to be. So in other words, their present condition is not the result of their negligence or their failure to duty. They fulfill their responsibility in exhortation and counsel to the fullest extent. They continue to counsel people, continue to give mashwara, endured severe oppression. They faced persecution until they were rendered powerless and sacrificed so many lives in struggle that their numbers were drastically reduced. Imam said, yes, they have experienced jihad in all of its dimensions. They have raised their voices from the depths of their hearts, offered counsel through reasoned speech, made sacrifices in armed struggle, giving victims to the point that many of their own ranks were lost. They made an impact, but they were subdued. This was because they had no helpers or supporters, and the balance of power between them and their enemy was in no way equal. Balance of power was lopsided. As long as they had hope of victory and a chance to uproot the corruption, they did not give up. They continued, they fought. When the hope was exhausted, only then you see these people going to seclusion, into inziva, and away from, and into taqiyya, in other words. The phrase قُتِلُوا حَتَّى قَلُّوا does not mean that all of them were killed until they became few. No, rather it means that a portion of them were martyred and only a small group remained. When, for example, there were 180 of them were martyred, only 20 remained. Now what do you really expect from these 22? Aql says going to Qadiyya. This is what you should do. لا تلقوا بأيديكم إلى التهلكة. Quran says, don't throw yourself into halakat. At this point it's halakat. It's not bravery. Some places you have to draw a line. And it goes from bravery to be impetuous. You're no longer in power. So in technical terms, this expression is a cause of attributing the description of a part to the whole. قُتِّلُوا حَتَّى قَلُّوا, meaning the entire, those all hypothetically 100 of them, قُتِّلُوا حَتَّى قَلُّوا. At this point, the following question arises: to which period does this classification of group relate? Given that Imam was governing the society with strength and authority, Imam had the power. Which part of the history is Imam referring to over here? Can I leave that as a homework for next week? The answer to this question becomes clear through a study of history of the Imam's era. And it is also reflected in the words of the great figure Imam himself, that social corruption had spread to such an extent that in practice, the radius of Imam's rule was confined to only Kufa. Right? And that reason for Imam to choose Kufa, to be away from Hijaz, to be away from the land of Wahi, Makkah and Medina, and to move so far away. In other words, Imam, the radius of Imam's rule was confined only to this one state and the surrounding areas. Even not too far away, Sham was not even in Imam's full control. In other words, in other regions such as Syria, Egypt, and elsewhere, corrupt, evildoers, and faithless oppressors had joined hands with one another and had driven the righteous out of the social media. So yeah, this very well could be the story of Imam's own time, Imam's own region. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then there's the last portion, inshallah, we'll discuss next week, where there's actually an extensive, you don't really see that much commentary by Sayyid Razi. Sayyid Razi is compiled, and then usually at the end of some sermons, he gives one-liners, two-liners. Here he gives an entire paragraph, which of course will take a lot of time, so I skipped it. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the tawfiq and ability to understand the words of Imam al-Kalam, Imam al-Bayan, al-Mu'mineen ibn Abi Talib, and also apply them in our daily lives. Wa akhir da'wana, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.